Welcome, everyone. I would like to firstly acknowledge that I am currently located in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, and that we are all treaty people. So this is the first event of the PEGASUS virtual event series, and my name is Alexandra Georges, and I am the member of the PEGASUS programming team. We are very grateful to be able to serve our community and grateful for the continued support of our partners. Because of their generous support, we are able to present this program for free. At PEGASUS, our mission is to reduce disparities, inequities, and social injustice and promote peace, global health, and sustainability. For our event today, I want to encourage everyone to join in the conversation. We want to make this as engaging and interactive as possible. You can share your feedback and comments via our social media channels on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Also, our presenter will be taking questions directly from our live audience. Ask your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can highlight questions by clicking the thumb icon to ensure we get the most pressing questions. Today's theme, or the title of the event, is Environmental Racism, Race, Place, and Geographies of Disease in Indigenous and Black Communities. Now, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Ingrid Waldron. Dr. Waldron is an associate professor in the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie University in Halifax. Dr. Waldron is the director of the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project, or the ENRICH Project. Dr. Waldron is a flagship co-lead of the Improving the Health of People of African Descent, or you may know Dr. Waldron as the author of There's Something in the Water that has been adapted in a Netflix documentary directed by Ellen Page. Now, welcome Dr. Waldron.
Thank you very much for having me. So I'm just going to begin by posing a few questions for you to consider. The first is, how do socially constructed ideologies about race, class, gender, and other social identities shape the constitution and perception of space? How are these ideologies spatialized in rural and urban settings? How is the spatial organization of Indigenous, Black, and other racialized bodies enabled through boundary-making practices supported by policy and law? How do ideologies about race, class, gender, and other identities inform policies and actions on environmental racism and other place-based inequalities? And what is the relationship between place, space, and health? So I'm just going to share my screen. So using my Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities and Community Health Project, the ENRICH Project, as a case study, this presentation will use a sociospatial analysis to discuss the symbolic and material ways in which the complex geographies of Indigenous, Black, and other communities have been characterized by domination, erasure, and exploitation. In doing so, I want to examine the relationship between race, place, space, and health in these communities in a way that will highlight the ways in which health and well-being are linked to the places and spaces where we live, work, and play. In this presentation, I characterize space as a socially constructed and highly contested product and idea bound up in political, cultural, and economic meanings. Understanding the spatial nature of state-sanctioned violence or spatial violence on the bodies, lands, cultures, and spirits of Indigenous and Black peoples in Canada requires a historical, site-specific, and context-specific analysis of how social, economic, and political inequalities play out within such institutions as the environment, housing, criminal justice, employment, labor, education, and health. By spatial violence, I'm referring to the ways in which racialized peoples are harmed by policies or the absence of policies that lead to unemployment and underemployment, income insecurity, poverty, food insecurity, poor quality public infrastructure, racism in the criminal justice system, health disparities, and other harms in Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities. I, however, always maintain a sustained and critical focus on race as the most important analytical entry point for understanding spatial violence in urban and rural spaces in Nova Scotia and Canada. Here's James Desmond. James Desmond is an environmental activist in Lincolnville. I visited that community in 2013 when I started the Enrich Project. The project is community-based, so I wanted to meet community members, affected community members. And we filmed a short video based on these workshops or meetings that we held in the community, in this community in Lincolnville. And James provides a really succinct, a very short, succinct, but right on definition of environmental racism, which I can unpack for you. So he says that environmental racism is the practice of locating industrial waste sites next to African, Nova Scotian, Native, and poor white communities, communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism, it's environmental racism to its core. And packed within that very simple definition are some of the main principles of environmental racism. So he's talking here about disproportionality, the fact that certain communities are disproportionately located near landfills, incinerators, pipelines, etc. He's talking about the fact that these communities are primarily non-white or racialized, but there are certainly poor white communities that are impacted by environmental racism. Right here in Nova Scotia, we have a community called Harrietsfield, which is a low-income, slightly rural white community that has been trying to address water contamination since the 1980s. He also says that these are communities that don't have a base to fight back. Essentially what he's saying is they don't have the economic or political clout. They do fight back, but because they lack economic and political clout, they're often not heard by government, or government is slow to act. So that's a really great, succinct definition of environmental racism, but I want to provide you with the more academic definition. And this comes from Dr. Robert Bullard, who is considered to be the father of environmental justice. He's written several books. One of the first was Dumping in Dixie in 1990. So here's the definition that he provides. He says that environmental racism is about the disproportionate location of and greater exposure of Indigenous and Black communities and other racialized communities to toxic waste. So that's essentially what James Desmond said in his quote. He also says that it's the lack of political power, as I mentioned earlier, that these communities have for resisting the placement of industrial polluters. But it's also about the implementation of policies. When we see the clustering or spatial clustering of industry in certain communities, it's an outcome of policy. It's an outcome of environmental policy, an outcome of environmental assessments, right, and decision making. So part of that definition of environmental racism must include how policies are developed, and that policies lead to what we see in many communities, the spatial clustering, as I said, of industry, of harmful industry and life-threatening poisons in these communities. But it's also about the disproportionate negative impacts of these policies and the fact that certain communities, as I said earlier, often don't get to be heard. So it often takes a long time for the government to act on some of their concerns. So there's a differential rate of cleanup oftentimes between non-white communities and white communities. Some communities who are members of the elite who are white may get their voices heard more frequently, but they also see action on their concerns much more quickly than other communities. And the other part of the environmental racism definition is one that is not often discussed, is just exclusion, right? The communities that are most impacted by environmental racism are typically the communities that we don't see on those environmental boards or regulatory bodies or environmental NGOs. Typically, when you look at an environmental NGO, you're not going to see people who are most impacted, the communities who are most impacted. Therefore, when you don't have an opportunity to hear the voices of the people who are impacted, to hear their concerns, their priorities, how environmental racism manifests in their community or impacts their community, then you're not taking that experience into account when you develop policies or you act on these issues. So in many ways, then environmental racism continues to manifest intergenerationally because you continue to do things as you always did without hearing the voices of those who are most impacted. So I would say those are the main principles of environmental racism. I want to provide a few case studies of environmental racism, beginning with Nova Scotia. These are the communities that I have worked with and partnered with for the past 8 years. You may know about Sabaganagati First Nation, and this is Doreen Bernard, who is walking alongside the Shubenacadie River. And since about 2014, the community has been resisting the development of bioltin gas of a brine discharge pipeline near the Shubenacadie River in Nova Scotia. There has been some achievements since early this year. However, if I have time, I could share that with you, or maybe I can say that they won their court case for the first time, and the government was ordered to consult with the community because the government felt that consultations were not done properly, despite what the minister indicated in 2016 that consultations were done well. For the first time, this community won their appeal, and that happened in April of this year. So this is a major achievement milestone for this community. You probably heard about Boat Harbor. Boat Harbor in Pictou Landing First Nation, extremely contaminated site. A pulp mill has been dumping effluent into Boat Harbor in Pictou Landing First Nation since 1967. And success again happened this year. Late last year, just before Christmas, the government announced that the mill will be closing down for the first time since 1967. He announced that, you know, he had given the mill enough time to do a robust environmental assessment, and they had not done that, and they could not keep making promises, broken promises to the community. So he announced last year in December that it will close at the end of January, and it did. So that's, of course, a massive achievement for this community. You probably heard of Amjinwang First Nation because it's in Ontario. Many of you are probably in Ontario. It's near Sarnia, Ontario, often referred to as Chemical Valley. And as you probably are aware, there are, you know, over 60 petrochemical facilities surrounding that community. And like many of the other communities in Canada, they have high rates of various illnesses. I'll talk about the health impacts of environmental racism later, but really high levels of cancer, etc., reproductive illnesses similar to Pictou Landing First Nation. Also in Ontario, Grassy Narrows First Nation, near Kenora, Ontario, they've been concerned about mercury contamination that was dumped in the Wabigoon English River near their community. I think first time in 1970s and again in 1980s. So they're concerned about the ongoing effects, of course, of mercury contamination on fish and on individuals. The case that has gotten perhaps a lot of attention over the past 2 years is in BC, Wet'suwet'en First Nation. A lot of information about this community and this fight in the media. So there have been mass demonstrations, sit-ins, blockades that have gripped this part of Canada over resistance around a multi-billion-dollar pipeline project near the community. So the movement has been about supporting the leaders of Wet'suwet'en First Nation who are opposed to this project. I don't know how many of you heard of Africville. I certainly never learned about Africville when I was a student. I think one of my professors mentioned it when I was doing my PhD, and I was like, how come I've never heard of Africville? This may be a historical case of environmental racism, but I also say it's present day because the descendants of Africville still experience the traumatizing after effects of the raising of Africville. So this is an example of environmental racism, but also gentrification or urban renewal. It's both. So this is about the expropriation of African Nova Scotians from Africville amid an urban renewal campaign on the part of the city of Halifax. They were trying to make way for industrial development and needed the community to get out, to put it bluntly. So they call this the raising of Africville. And this was a flourishing community. It wasn't a wealthy community, but a flourishing community. Community members had their own businesses. It was a thriving community in terms of the fact that the community members were connected. There were great social networks. Many of the community members who were expropriated are now living in the north end of Halifax, which is an urban part or the city center of Halifax, but they're in public housing now, which wasn't the case when they were in Africville. Why is it an example of environmental racism as well as urban renewal? Well, this is what was left in its wake. Various kind of environmental and social hazards, including a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. That community has continued to fight to get reparations. As recently as 2016, they tried to launch a class action lawsuit, but that class action lawsuit was thrown out in 2018. So I'm not sure what plans the community has now to continue to fight back, to say that we've lost in many ways. We've lost financially, we've lost our home, we've lost our community, and we are owed something. So I'm not sure what's in the works at the moment. Here's Lincolnville, another African Nova Scotian community. I showed you a photo of James Desmond earlier. This is his community. And they have been concerned about a first and second generation landfill since 1974 and 2006. And they would say that the high rates of cancer in their community is linked to this landfill, and everything went into that landfill, including PCBs. This is a community that is tired. They've been fighting for a long time. But I, over the years, I've connected them with a few individuals like Equal Justice, which is a Canadian law charity, to see whether or not there are legal remedies that they can pursue to address this particular issue. They would say that there's been an economic fallout from the location of or the placement of this landfill in their community. For one, they were promised jobs that never panned out, but they also said that people left their community. People don't want to buy homes in their community. People don't want to open up businesses. So for them, there's been an economic fallout, and they feel once again that they're owed something, financial compensation. I'm also working with Shelburne. If you saw the movie I co-produced with Ellen Page called There's Something in the Water, Shelburne is featured. It's the first community that's featured. Another historic African Nova Scotian community. I don't know how much you know about African Nova Scotians, but they've been in Canada for over 300 years. And when most African Nova Scotians, there are about 53 historic African Nova Scotian communities. They tend to live in rural areas, right? So they're not immigrant communities. They don't tend to, they're not living in the city center. They're living primarily in isolated, out of the way rural areas. So that comes with other challenges, of course. The intersection of race and class and education and rural living comes with a lot of challenges. And I think those intersections actually enable environmental racism in many ways, because those are communities that have less power. So this is one such community. I met a leader there at the end of 2015. The woman in the film actually, Louise DeLeo, I wanted her to conduct focus groups for me. And when she sat down in my office, I explained what environmental racism was to her. And she said, oh, wow, about 97% of the people in my community have cancer. Are you saying that it's linked to this landfill? And I never say that it is, because we cannot say that definitively as scientists, but you can say, yes, it's highly likely. So this is a community that's had issues with high cancer rates, multiple myeloma, particularly, which is a blood cancer, but they also have issues around well water. The white community in the north end is on municipal water. The black community, which is the community I'm referring to, which is in the south end, they have always been on well water, which, as you probably know, is more contaminated. So there are a lot of kind of public infrastructure inequalities, as well as environmental racism that they have to contend with. So environmental racism is an example of spatial violence, I guess is what I'm saying. You know, when we think of our spaces and places where we live, work, and play, policies that lead to the placement of these sites in these communities is an example of spatial violence. The ways in which race and class and education are imbued in the places and spaces where we live, work, and play, and how those issues, those identities, those social categories shape policy and lead to inequality and longstanding forms of racism. Climate change is also another example of spatial violence, very much so. People would argue that we're all impacted by climate change. Yes, we are all impacted by climate change. But why is it a climate justice issue? Because for communities that are racialized, communities that are poor, for women around the world, women in developing countries particularly, when climate change hits them, it's much more difficult to fight back against it, right? Because of their social standing. So while climate change impacts all of us, our ability to fight back, to come back from climate change impacts will be different for different communities. And that's why we need to have a climate justice framework or lens. Climate change then is another example of how race is spatialized in our communities. So Indigenous, racialized, and impoverished communities then globally experience what we would call double jeopardy, or I would say triple jeopardy from the climate crisis, right? Race, class, gender, or poverty, quadruple, I guess, quadruple jeopardy, because they are disproportionately exposed to environmental pollutants, as we just mentioned with environmental racism, in the places where they reside. But they are also more likely to be impacted by floods, intense heat waves, frequent and heavy rainfall, as well as higher rates of climate-related disease. But as I mentioned earlier, gender must be part of our discussion when we construct a climate change narrative, because climate change and resource shortages not only hit impoverished communities first and worst, but they also impact women and men differently. Women around the world, of course, make up the largest group of people living below the poverty line. And they tend to, you know, not in every single country, but in many countries, they're responsible for gathering and producing food, collecting water, sourcing fuel for heating and cooking. Therefore, those issues, their roles in the domestic sphere, their roles outside the domestic sphere make them more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation. So this is where we have that climate justice lens, right? It's not good enough today to say, oh, we're all impacted by climate change, which I've heard people say. And why are you making a big deal of race, you know? And this is why we have to be critical. We have to have a critical lens when we talk about climate justice and how it impacts people differently. So it speaks to me about how important it is for the climate change movement in Canada, but of course around the world, to make a bigger space for a deeper engagement with this climate justice framework that considers race, gender, class, poverty, and other social identities, and how they intersect to disproportionately expose people to the impacts of climate change. But we also need to connect our discussions on climate change to other forms of spatial violence. You know, everything is connected. Environmental racism is connected to climate change, but climate change is also connected to employment and underemployment. And when we think about the communities that are also linked to the climate justice narrative, we also have to think about 2S LGBT communities, disabled communities. We need to connect various forms of state violence together, right? So climate change doesn't happen on its own. We need to understand climate change as intersecting with issues around labor and employment and public infrastructure. These are structural inequities, state-sanctioned forms of violence that are intersectional and interconnected. So we need to start to progress in a way that understands that all issues are connected. And in order to address climate change, or in order to address environmental racism, we have to address all forms of oppression. Public infrastructure is, of course, another way in which space is racialized. It's another form of spatial violence because public infrastructure or planning policies can be harmful. The ways in which planning policies are implemented or the absence of policies can be harmful. And they're most harmful to women, racialized communities, etc. So we need to think, and LGBTQ communities who also suffer from income insecurity, poverty, and housing insecurity. So the absence of policies, the ways in which policies are implemented, are forms of spatial violence if they harm. So we know that public infrastructure is about the human-made or modified physical surroundings in which people live, work, and play. And that, of course, includes housing and roads and transit design, transportation, how walkable your city is or your rural area, the bikeability in your area, parks and waste, green space, recreation centers, pollution and contamination. All of these are public infrastructure issues. And studies have actually shown that in North America, underprivileged populations, racialized peoples have less access to green space. And this is a health issue, right? Have less access to trees and green space than affluent groups. In Canadian cities like Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal, public infrastructure inequalities manifest in low-income households that have limited access to the benefits provided by vegetation. In Black communities in Nova Scotia, most of which, as I said earlier, are rural, there are other public infrastructure harms. So I talked about the reliance on well water in the south end of Shelburne, but that's also the case in other communities, other Black communities like North Preston. I can talk about Lucasville, an African Nova Scotian community. Zoning bylaws shrunk that community in half about 4 years ago, but the community resisted. They fought back and they were able to change that. But once again, the city of Halifax trying to push people out to make way for industry and business. In Cherrybrook, Lake Loon, another African Nova Scotian community, there's a lack of a community center or space for that community. So these are all kind of longstanding public infrastructure inequalities that are harmful because we know our spaces, our environments are key to our health and our well-being. So for me, this leads to health disparities in many ways. These are structural inequities within our social structures that have impacts on people's health. So when we think of spatial forms of violence, we have to think about how do they harm people's well-being, their individual health, but also their community health. When we talk about community health, it's more about not whether or not people have diseases, but it's more about whether or not an area, a rural area, or an urban area is functioning well, if that community has access to the resources that it needs. So in other words, there is a strong relationship between place, space, race, and health. And as I said in the Netflix documentary, your postal code determines your health. We know that now, where you live. If I think of Halifax, if I think of Montreal or Toronto, both of which I lived in, I know that where people live has a lot of bearing on their health because it's about the resources that they have access to, the services they have access to, whether or not they live in areas where there is green space, whether or not they live near to clinics, whether or not they live near to organic stores with healthy food. All of those things have bearing on your health. And we know that spatially, or in terms of public policy, there are certain areas that don't have the benefit because policies haven't allowed certain communities to have certain privileges, or I shouldn't even say privileges, access to resources that everybody should have. So that's how we need to understand that relationship between place, space, race, and health, that those things are intimately tied. And that well, I said this already, your postal code has bearing on your health. So I want to talk a little bit about the health risks associated with contamination and pollution. I talked a little bit about it earlier, but I want to give you a bit of a list. just so you get a sense of how serious environmental racism is, I know when I started the project, I visited, I met with some government people at Nova Scotia Environment, and they seem to want proof that there is a health impact from environmental racism. But you know, if you look at the studies in Canada over the past 20 years, and you look at studies in the United States, there's a clear link between pollutants and illness. So these illnesses include cancer, upper respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, reproductive morbidity, including preterm births, allergies, skin rashes, abdominal pain, temporary liver dysfunction, and seizures. What about climate change? Climate change is linked to, I'd like to focus specifically on mental health issues. People are now using the term ecological grief or climate anxiety. These are terms that refer to the anxiety or stress that people are feeling about loss from climate change, but also, you know, sometimes you hear from young people who question whether or not they should be having families because of the state of the world. You know, that's concerning. I don't think in my generation or before that we ever thought about whether or not we should have a family based on climate change impacts, right? So these are anxieties and psychological stress that are outcomes of people's worry about climate change impacts. So there are studies, one by, is it Kavanaugh? But there's actually a professor at the University of Labrador who's a expert on climate grief. So I would also suggest that you look at her work. But we know that climate change is linked to elevated rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, post-traumatic stress, and a host of negative emotions, including anger, hopelessness, despair, and as I said earlier, feelings of loss. So those mental health issues or emotions are all referred to as ecological grief. I mentioned already that greenness is linked to health. Studies also show that exposure to greenness and other beneficial features of the built environment is another way of saying public infrastructure in many ways, that it contributes to the reduction of all-cause mortality, the reduction of cardiovascular disease incidence and mortality, the reduction of respiratory disease mortality, and the reduction of adverse birth outcomes. So in other words, place matters to health, and health outcomes and disparities are products of where we live and the resources we have access to or don't have access to, including jobs, housing, food, health services, public transit, etc. So my work has really included all of these things. When I started doing my research, I didn't see the connection. I just had an interest in gentrification, and I was doing that independently of any other research that I was doing, not seeing the links. And then I started doing environmental racism, and then I said, oh, these are all place-based inequalities that have impacts on health. They're forms of spatial violence. There's something here, you know. And it's only kind of later on I said, okay, these are things that I need to find a connection to, and I need to be able to articulate it in a way that demonstrates their intersections. And to have a term like spatial violence, that's really key for me, to be able to have a term that articulates those intersections. So over the years, I've been trying to do various things to address some of these issues through my Enrich project, which began 8 years ago in 2012 in the spring. And the Enrich project is a community-based, collaborative, partnered, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, multi-method, multimedia project. And what I like about this project is that it's fun for me because I can be creative. And I don't say no when somebody comes to me with an idea. When I say yes, I found that it's taken me on an interesting path. So I like to meet with people, and I like new ideas. And I believe that the Enrich project is about being creative and innovative to find solutions, but also to understand that solutions are interdisciplinary. And I know that because I work with teams of people that are from different disciplines than my own, different professions, and we work together extremely well. So this has shown me, this has taught me that solutions must be interdisciplinary. We need to transcend our silos. That's what I've learned from doing this project. What I needed to do early on was actually to raise awareness, because when I started the project, people would come up to me and say to me, I've never heard of environmental racism, what is it? And some of them were really doubtful too, like maybe they were snickering in a way, like, how can the environment be racist? This is ridiculous. I think somebody wrote that comment in the Chronicle Herald, our main newspaper online. What is Ingrid Waldron on about? How can the environment be racist? And I get it, right? Because you have to understand policy. It's the policies that can be racist. It's not the soil or the environment necessarily, right? It's the policies. So I recognized early on that I needed to do some awareness raising, and what has really worked for me is public engagement events at the Central Library, the North End Library, everywhere. This has been great because it's raised awareness, at least in Nova Scotia. I don't know about the rest of Canada or Toronto, but I would say in Nova Scotia, I've been doing this for 8 years now, and I would say Nova Scotians have a greater awareness about this issue than any province in Canada. So I'm proud of that. So I continue to do it. And what's great about it is that when I hold these events, I always get people who want to volunteer, and that's also really important when sometimes you don't have a grant, right? So you get young people particularly who just want to volunteer their time. So I continue to do that. And what I try to do always is to bring both communities together, the Indigenous community and the Black community. And of course, with any panel, you want people to bring different perspectives. So in this particular event that you're seeing here from 2015, which remains my favorite event that I've ever done, you've got Lenore Zan standing up, who's a politician who I'll talk about later, and that you've got Doreen Bernard in black. At the end, you've got Carolyn Wright Parks in brown, who's kind of, you can't see her. You've got Mary Desmond in blue, and I showed you a photo of James Desmond earlier. They're not related, but she's also an activist in Lincolnville, in the same community as James. And you have Lynn Jones in green, who is a noted social activist, the sister of Rocky Jones, who passed away in 2013, and he was connected to the Black Panther movement in his day. He was a major civil rights activist in Nova Scotia. So you want people with different perspectives. And I certainly, with every event that I do, I'm bringing together both the Indigenous and Black communities, because what I felt in Nova Scotia is that it's so segregated. It's just really segregated. Even the events are segregated. I would turn around and notice that only one group is in the audience. And I said to myself when I came, I said, I'm going to bring everybody together. So when you go to my event, you're seeing everybody. And to me, that's how it should be. As an academic, of course, I need to write. I need to document evidence. You're not going to be taken seriously. It's part of my job, but also you're not going to be taken seriously unless you have evidence. And when I visited Nova Scotia Environment 2013, the policy person there said to me, you keep saying that, there's a health impact, Ingrid, that they have high rates of cancer, but where's your proof? So I said to myself, then I said, I better write a book, because I'm going to need proof or evidence, etc. So this book is a bit of a case study on environmental racism in Nova Scotia. But if you read the book, you'll see it's across Canada. I talk about the communities I talked about earlier, like Amjinwang, First Nation, Grassy Narrows, etc. And also cases in Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick. So it's a bit of a case study on Nova Scotia, a little bit on Canada as well, but I also look at the United States. I have a chapter on community-based research and the challenges I've had conducting that and what people need to think about when they're doing research with marginalized communities. I also want to document the long history of struggle of these communities. I'm doing what I'm doing on their backs, right? They've been mobilizing for years, for decades before I came along. So I wanted to respect that and highlight that. But I also wanted to focus as a health researcher on health impacts. So chapter 5 is exclusively on health, from the psychological perspective to the physical perspective. This is a map that's actually really great evidence. When this map was released to the media and to the public, some people were like, okay, there's evidence, okay. It kind of quieted them a bit, because they were actually able to see the spatial clustering of toxic waste sites in the communities. This was a visual documentation of everything that I was saying for those who didn't believe it. And this is a map that was actually used in the film, the Netflix film. So this is a student created this map for me. If you go onto my website, you'll see that one layer is for Indigenous communities and another layer for Black communities, showing proximity to incinerators, landfills, and pulp and paper mills. I just showed you an event that I put on. In the audience of that event was Fred Bonner. And he said, I really loved your event, but why don't we give these communities a win? I said, what do you mean by a win? He said, well, something tangible to keep them engaged. I said, what would that be? He said, why don't we test their water? I said, well, I'm not a water tester. I'm not an environmental scientist. I wouldn't know how to do that. He said, yeah, but I'm a hydrogeologist. And I think we should give them a win, something much more immediate. And I said, yeah, that sounds really great. This is an example of somebody coming to my office and proposing an idea and me saying yes, which is what I've tended to do for the past 8 years, because it has led me down great paths, you know. And what we have now is Rural Water Watch, an NGO. When he proposed the water testing project, that wasn't through this NGO. That was just a, you know, we formed a working group and we decided to test water in Lincolnville, and it worked. You know, it worked well. We produced a report. We shared the report with the community. We were able to tell them what pollutants were in their groundwater. We went back to the community, did a workshop, talked about the link between health and contaminated water. We showed the community how to test their own water. We also trained students. We had environmental science students who we trained on how to test water. And we thought, this is a really great blueprint. It's a great template for an NGO. So that water testing project in Lincolnville was in 2016, and in 2017 spring, we decided to form this NGO. We got charitable status this year, but it has been an NGO since 2017, and we are testing water in rural, marginalized communities. We also do healthy wells workshops. On October 18th, we had our first Healthy Wells Day, that we use online resources and in-person activities to create awareness about the need to keep your well healthy. An unhealthy well will lead to an unhealthy person. It can lead to various illnesses. So we're going to be doing that every single year. I mentioned eco-justice earlier. You know about eco-justice probably. There's an office in Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary. An office was opened in Halifax in 2018. I met with the lawyers there. I talked about the communities here, and they have been working with the communities to look at legal remedies. I'm partnering with Let's Sprout, 2 young women, Dalhousie graduates from the sustainability department, approached me and said they would like to work with me one day. A year later, we started working together. This is about education. This is about getting at the young people. When people say to me, what's the solution? What's the remedy to environmental racism? One of the things I say in addition to legislation is getting at the young people who will be our future leaders, the young people who will hold positions of power in government, in Nova Scotia environment. They will hold positions of power. So how do we get to them? How do we get to them with the right narrative and understandings, critical understandings of environmental racism? Because I don't think the people in power right now have, well, I know they don't have the correct, I will say, or the considered understanding of environmental racism, how it manifests, but how it's connected to colonialism and settler colonialism. Yes, these are very intellectual terms, but I don't feel that the people in power have a critical, deep understanding of these issues and why they matter, but how they manifest. So I'm working with Let's Sprout to try to change or transform the high school and middle school curricula. What we're doing first is creating innovative online tools that teachers can use in the classroom to teach about environmental racism. But in the long term, what we want to do is to change the curriculum so there's more information about the histories of Indigenous peoples and African Nova Scotian peoples, but also about colonialism and environmental racism. We know that that's going to be challenging, but that's our mission with this particular project, getting at young people who will have leadership positions. I'm currently working with Climate Action Services on a climate change project. I have to say that I haven't been that engaged in the topic of climate change. As you've seen earlier, I have an analysis of it, but I haven't really done any projects on it. And I said to myself, well, this is a timely issue. This is the issue of our day. I need to get with it. I need to start doing work on climate change. So I am actually this week putting in a grant for workshops in 4 African Nova Scotian communities with Climate Action Services. The people behind Climate Action Services are retired climate change professionals. So they're going to really facilitate the workshop. I am not a climate change expert in any way, but my role is to engage the communities, recruit them, and they will be facilitating the workshop. 2 workshops in each of the 4 communities. First workshop is about getting a sense of people's priorities and creating awareness. The follow-up workshop is about how do we support you in climate change adaptation. So I'm very excited about this because I think this is now my foray into climate change, and the fact that I feel that marginalized community, the message isn't getting to the marginalized communities. The message isn't getting to African Nova Scotians. Just from the response I get, people think this is not something that is of concern right now. I've got other things on my plate. I've got issues around policing and finding a job and putting food on the table, and climate change just isn't something that I need to consider right now. And I understand that feeling, but I also think, is there a different way in? Is there some messaging that I can create that will get to them in a way that the climate scientists have not? So that's what I'm trying to figure out with this workshop project. I also train students, of course, which has been very exciting. What I found is that environmental racism and all the issues that I discussed tonight are so interdisciplinary that I've gotten students from across campus wanting to be trained or mentored, etc. Sociology, planning, medicine, health professions, geography, environmental science, political science, health, etc. Yeah, the opportunity to train students in different disciplines, but also to learn about how their disciplines or professions are implicated in what I'm doing has been actually really revealing for me and very exciting. I talked about the importance of creating awareness in doing events, but I've also continued to create awareness through media. I give so many different media interviews in print and radio and podcasts and television, because there's always going to be somebody who doesn't know what environmental racism is. You're not going to want to act on an issue if you don't empathize with the issue. You can't empathize with the issue if you don't have information on the issue. So if I want people to act on the issue and to mobilize on the issue, then I have to keep creating awareness about the issue so they understand it. So yeah, I will continue to use the media to get the message out. Of course, you know about, hopefully you know about the Netflix documentary. This was just a kind of stroke of luck. I woke up one morning, October of 2018, found out that Ellen Page was following my Twitter page, but also promoting my book. When we finally spoke on the phone in late October and also early 2019, we finally, after many conversations, decided that a film would be a good way to go. Well, initially it was a 10-minute film actually to post on Twitter. And then when I saw the footage at her mother's home, I said, I think we need to do something much more significant than a 10-minute video that we would slap onto Twitter. Why don't we do a full-length feature film, 70 minutes? They all agreed, including the co-director, Ian Page. And we took it to TIFF. That was also a stroke of luck. The film that screened at TIFF was very rough. They did try to, to edit it and very quickly before the deadline, but it was really rough, but people seemed to enjoy it. So we took it to TIFF last year, September 9th. And I knew at that time that it would be going to Netflix. The women in the film did not. I wanted it to be a surprise. But all of that was kind of formalized in October of last year that it was going to Netflix. It started, this is us at TIFF last year. Yeah, all the women in the film. The last part of the film, you see the grassroots grandmother. That's the final feature in the film. So all the women are there who are speaking. They're all called the grassroots grandmothers. And then Netflix, it started streaming on Netflix March 29th of this year, which has been really a gift. I'm hearing from people around the world saying how inspiring the women are. And that's what I want. Inspiration leads to action, perhaps, in your own time. Maybe it doesn't lead to action right now, but who knows when people are ready. But when journalists ask me, what do you want to come out of this film? I said to everyone, I said, I want people to be inspired. So that seems to have happened. Lenore Zand, who was standing up in pink in that first photo that I showed you, the event that I held, her and I developed the first environmental racism bill in 2015. It was called Bill 111, an act to address environmental racism, never turned into legislation. Although Lenore kept trying, she kept reintroducing it every year. She moved from the NDP party to the Liberal Party 2 years ago, and she approached me earlier this year before COVID hit and said, Ingrid, remember that 2015 bill? I said, yeah. She said, why don't we turn that into a federal bill? We need to change a few things in the bill. So she sent me the bill that we did, and then I made some comments and provided feedback. And she introduced it as a federal bill in the House of Commons on February 26th of this year. Plans were being made at that time to put it forward to second reading. And then COVID hit Nova Scotia in March 14th, I believe. And so I said to her, what now? She said, well, we don't know what's going to happen with the pandemic, so we're just going to have to wait. I emailed her 2 weeks ago, and because she had been saying for a long time, I'll put it forward to second reading in the fall. And I was like, okay, fall is here. What's happening? So I emailed her 2 weeks ago and I said, what's happening? And she said, Ingrid, good news. We can put it forward December 2nd. So I'm trying to rally the troops. There are various networks that I'm connected to see how we can create some kind of campaign to make it easy for the public to kind of write to their politicians and to, yeah, I've done that before. So I want to strategically create a campaign that would allow people to reach out to politicians, but that so that they don't have to think too much, and that we would make it very easy for them to do that. So we're kind of looking at that right now.
Yeah, Ingrid.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. No, it's just because we're just about at the end of time. I want to have a little bit of time for the respondents and the questions.
Yeah, so I'll stop there with some of the things I've been doing, and I'm very happy to take everybody's questions. Yeah.
Okay, so sorry about that, but I have seen that a few people have had to leave, so I want to make sure we have our respondents here. And I really appreciate that you want an opportunity to plan action, to develop the networks, and I think our respondents may be helpful in that. So we've got two respondents. First, Dorothy Larkman, an associate professor at Nipissing University, and second, Theresa McClenahan, the executive director and counsel of the Canadian Environmental Law Association. And we have a few people who've posted the things in the Q&A that I'll read to you. Okay. And then we can think about how to move things forward after this.
Sure.
So Dorothy, would you like to share a few comments on the presentation and from your own experience?
Thank you, Ingrid. That was, I actually got to watch your video also, and it was informative too. I'm always interested in finding out ways to look after the earth. Because we've been told that I'm Indigenous. My background is that I'm from the Matachwan First Nation, and so we're always have always been in the forefront of combating that through policies, whatever policies that were coming to us, whether it was for forestry or mining or any other issues like that are around. Dump was a major one too for our area. The Adams mine was going to be used for a dump, and we became involved with that and worked with other people. But what I found is that we obviously couldn't do it alone. And I don't believe you are doing it alone. Because I was wondering, how are you going to be doing this? But you've mentioned so many different areas where you're expanding to combat a lot of this. And I can appreciate that. And part of in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, how do we not just the Matachwan First Nation, but anyone tap into that? Because you've given a lot of different ones, but when I think of Indigenous people, we're so far north, and we don't have necessarily all of the abilities to be able to connect with people. and to be able to create that awareness, because I think for a number of years we've been like Grassy Narrows is still Grassy Narrows, and there's still all of that happening, and it doesn't seem to how much awareness is created, it's not changing.
Mhm.
And you talk about policies, and when you the last piece when you're talking about speaking with the governmental piece of it, and trying to get that bill through, um, our experience is that people tend to ignore policy. And so I think coming back to the grassroots grandmothers, the grassroots people, to be able to reach them and how we can do that or how that can be accomplished. And so I appreciated your talk in the sense that it provides hope that that can still be there, that that can move forward, that we can link somewhere somehow in doing that. So I appreciate your talking about that. And what I teach in university is social work, and this definitely can be part of one of my classes, if not a couple of them, for them to be, because we do talk about the environment and how it affects people socially. And so your book and what you've done already definitely will help in that respect for those students, younger students. The other piece that I really appreciated was when you said that you had to reach the young people. My mother, when I started this work in social work, my mother was the one that said, the older people are set, leave them be, go work with the young people. They're the ones who are going to make the change. And she said that obviously a number of years ago. And so I appreciated hearing you say that also. And that has been part of the reason or the focus I stay with teaching at the university is to continue with that, to teach the young people, to try to create that understanding of what the needs are. So miigwech for that. Mm-hmm. Thank you,
Thank
Neil.
you. Yeah, I think with the Enrich project, I'm trying to do different things because I used to feel that I needed to rely on policy or legislation. And look how long it's taken that to happen. So I then realized that I need to come at it in different ways, that even though awareness raising doesn't seem that important, I think it is actually. I think it's one of the most important things, perhaps more important than legislation. So you see me doing a lot of things because I think there are different ways to address it. I like the immediacy of Rural Water Watch because you're actually testing people's water and they can now manage their drinking water supply. So that's really important because people want something immediate. They can't, they're tired of waiting for legislation to happen. The legislation is also important. When I said to Lenore Zan, I said, what do you think about civil disobedience and mobilizing, and are all those things important? She said, yes, Ingrid, they're important. They get the attention that people want. They get attention in the media, but if you don't have legislation and you don't hold the government's feet to the fire and you don't make the government accountable, all that civil disobedience doesn't mean that much. I don't know if people agree with that, but I think they go hand in hand. So I kind of think everything matters. And this is such a tough issue. I know what you're saying, it's like it's been going on forever. And, I'm new to this really, and I'm connected with environmental people and I respect them because they're doing so many things. And it must be frustrating because people have been doing this longer than I have and they're seeing very slow change. And I kind of wonder how they're doing it. And they keep going at it with another angle and another angle, and things seem to be slow to change. But then when I look at the successes this year with Boat Harbor and Sabagan Nagadi First Nation, just since December, all of that has happened. And Shelburne got a new well paid for by Ellen Page, but they also got 5 wells from Housing Nova Scotia. There have been major achievements over the last few months in Nova Scotia. So it tells me that something is happening, perhaps at least in Nova Scotia. And there's been a lot of mobilizing. I respect the Indigenous community here because they keep going and going and going and going. And they have a lot of support and a lot of allies. And they have a strategy. They use their Facebook page well. The Grassroots Grandmothers Facebook page, or the Treaty Truck House Facebook page. And then they have in-person educational sessions. They seem to have a strategy and they have a lot of support from non-Indigenous people, white people particularly here in Nova Scotia, who help them, who are always out to support them. So I do think all this is meaningful. We have yet to get to what we want, but this is such a tough issue because it's about profit. It's about profit. So it's always going to be difficult.
Thank you, Ingrid. And now Teresa.
All right, thank you very much, Neil, for inviting me. Ingrid, that was an extremely inspirational presentation, and thank you for that. No, and given that your aim is to inspire people, I can say that for at least one person in the audience, myself, that was a success. I thought the term spatial violence was a very interesting and useful one, and the analytical framework that you bring, and quite a few things that you mentioned really ring true. So we're a legal aid clinic here in Ontario, a specialty clinic, and also a Canadian NGO. And looking at environmental impacts on vulnerable communities is our, completely core concern. But I learned a lot from the work you described, and we have so much more to do. Some of the things you mentioned that really rang true for me included the lack of political power that the communities have that you're working with, and the history of exclusion of those communities, in Indigenous and racialized communities. And we certainly see that in our work, and you saying that when there's no opportunity for the decision makers and the policymakers to hear the voices of these communities, then they're not taking those experiences into account. And that's absolutely true. And I was especially struck when you talked about the flourishing community that was displaced for other interests, because I think you're absolutely right that would not have happened with a more powerful, wealthier white community. It just would never have happened. It wouldn't even have been thought about as an option. Your point that the Nova Scotia government wanted proof of the health impacts absolutely comes up all the time. We face that all the time. And even when we think the evidence has started to get beyond, what we would call in a civil law context, a balance of probabilities, it's still not enough to budge the politicians often. So I liked your framing that it's the policies that are racist. It's not the soil that's racist, which is a great line, because it does tell us that, well, something happened in a series of decisions that resulted in this context. It didn't just happen by accident. And your point that it's often the lack of policy that's just as important. A couple other things that jumped out at me that I think are really great takeaways. The map that showed the visual in terms of the proximity vis-a-vis the material deprivation index. We did some work like that a number of years ago around Great Lakes, the high polluters in the National Pollutant Release Inventory, and the income levels by postal code. And it was pretty startling to see that on a visual display. It really needs to be updated, but your map just kind of hits you in the gut to see that. And I think it's so persuasive for people who are skeptical about these claims. And we're doing work as well lately on vulnerable people and climate change in Ontario, really trying to figure out, so many communities adopted environmental or climate change emergency declarations last year. So now we want to know, are they taking into account equity at all as they start to implement those action plans? And we're hearing generally, at least from the most interested communities, that they really want to do that, but they don't know how to do that. And I think your work is extremely useful in helping with starting to be able to provide a menu of these are the hows that can actually make a difference. And the environmental racism bill, Neil's point that networking is so key to our work as it is to yours, and making sure people are aware of that through all kinds of networks is something that we can take on. And I am really encouraged by the the recent wins that you highlighted in the work, and these are sometimes after decades and decades of effort by these clients, and the clients, it just amazes me that they can, and the communities, that they can stay with the program long enough to actually see these results. And it takes a toll. It really takes a toll. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is just to make sure that the audience is aware that the themes you were discussing were also echoed in the just completed Canada country visit of the UN Human Rights High Commissioner's Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Hazardous Substances, Bhaskar Tunsak. And he's just posted his draft final statement, which he presented in September. And he said I'm just looking at the press statement, which is a pithy place to get some of the takeaways, but his report, for everybody on this call, you were interested enough to dial in after hours, most of you, and listen to this for an hour. So you really should also read this report, because it substantiates, and if we're looking for documentation and things that we can put in front of policymakers and decision makers, things like this are just invaluable. And so he said, when he examined the concerns and the socioeconomic factors where resulting impacts like on health and on justice were found, he said, his words, the question of discrimination becomes simply unavoidable. There exists a pattern in Canada where marginalized groups, Indigenous peoples in particular, find themselves on the wrong side of a toxic divide, subject to conditions that would not be acceptable elsewhere in Canada. And then he also mentioned, as I'm sure you were probably involved in, the Canadian Human Rights Committee raising similar concerns in the third cycle of the UN Human Rights Council's review of Canada regarding environmental racism faced by communities of African descent. And it's not just within Canada, it's also Canadian actors acting outside of Canada, which he discussed as well, such as in the mining sector. So I'm really struck. I think the combination of movements that are giving rise to the incredible angst, I think, in all right-thinking people, is something where these intersections are starting to become obvious to people. And your point about inspiration leading to action is, I think, where we have a jumping off point for maybe seeing a lot more action in the next 10 years than we've seen in the last 50. So thank you so much for the inspiration that you brought us today with
Thank you for all those comments. Wow. You took notes and everything. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Neil, we can't hear you.
Now that we're getting towards the end of our time, I actually would like to try to put all of about 3 or 4 questions in one, and maybe have Ingrid respond, but if any of the other respondents wish to reply, they're welcome to do this. Teresa, someone asked about a link to the unreport that you just quoted. So if you could share that in the chat. And then Steve Ferracuti asked a couple of questions, which I think may be somewhat related. So Steve asks specifically, do you believe that there are public policy solutions or even partial solutions that are possible without significant economic model restructuring? And I'm going to add Keelan Solly's comment about, do you have any thoughts about how to improve spaces or improve things in terms of the biophysical environment, improve access to clinics and healthy foods without accidentally driving up prices and causing some form of gentrification? So again, looking at our current models here, and Steve adds that most boardrooms are not diverse, nor are they actively aware of these issues. And sadly, the boardrooms and backrooms still drive the private sector and public sector agenda. Can a progressive capitalistic system allow the changes required? So a little bit of a complex question. And then he added, again, I think what has been in the minds of many of us is the current what he terms a Mi'kmaq moderate lively dispute. Is this an example of environmental racism? And what do you make of the fact that there seems to be more support distantly than locally, as he feels? So, so a couple of challenging things for you, Ingrid.
Oh, those are challenging. In terms of the fisheries issue, it's not environmental racism, but it's connected to environmental racism, because environmental racism is about the notion that these are indigenous lands, and settlers' domination and imposition on their lands to exploit their resources, which is environmental racism, or to tell them when they can fish, and to say to them that they're fishing off season, is an example of white dominance and white privilege, particularly when these are their lands. They don't have to get permission in many ways about when they can fish. So similarly, in environmental racism, these are indigenous lands, and settlers come into their lands to exploit their resources for profit. So in that way, it's connected, because at the heart of environmental racism is about settler colonialism, right? It's about going into indigenous lands and exploiting them. In the same way, that dominance that we saw in the fisheries issue speaks to this very same issue. So while it's not an example of environmental racism in the classic sense, in terms of environmental racism being about polluting industries, it's a branch on the same tree. In terms of solutions, in public infrastructure and other spaces, I don't know if I could answer this, in any considered way given our time, but I believe that the solutions to many problems, many issues, the solution is interdisciplinary. And we have to find ways to transcend silos. The planner, to me, should be working with the health professional, who should be working with the environmental scientist, and all of them should be working with communities. But in planning, they tend to not consult with communities. They don't necessarily want to consult with communities because they know what communities will tell them. They know what the descendants of Africville will say to them. North End Halifax right now is undergoing, or has been undergoing, gentrification. They know that if they hear from the communities and they respond to the community's concerns, in many ways they can't do what they want to do, right? So that's why they don't consult. So I don't know if I have the answer to that, but I do know that when we stay within our silos, we don't have the answers. I think the planner needs to know about health. I think in planning school, planning students in university need to understand health impacts. I think they need to understand environmental racism. I think they need to know about climate science. I think all of these issues are interdisciplinary issues, and students typically are taught, are given knowledge that's solely within their field. I mean, I'm often asked to do presentations now in the planning department at Dalhousie, which is very interesting. I'm not a planner. I can't tell them anything about planning policies, but they seem to want to hear from me. So that's an example of what because I talk about environmental racism, but I also talk about the things that I talked about today without any planning experience. But they're getting something from my talk, obviously, because they keep asking me to come back, right? So that's an example of why students and others need to hear about these issues that are outside their field and outside their discipline, because the solution to many of our issues are interdisciplinary. We need to hear, of course, the voices of the people who are impacted, but that requires meaningful engagement, and that's not being done. On the issue of environmental racism, there's a reason it's not being done. You don't want to halt these industries because you're making profit from these industries, so you don't truly want to hear their voices. But with respect to any issue, you have to be doing the hiring. There needs to be equitable hiring. You need to understand how to outreach to different communities in effective ways. You need to engage them in all the activities that you're doing from the get-go. So this, to me, is part of the solution. But also, if you have power and you have connections and networks, I think the woman earlier said that in her community up north, they're not connected to anyone. And if you have privilege and power, despite my race and my gender, I have privilege. I have privilege because I'm situated in a university. I also have privilege because I have networks of climate scientists and environmental scientists. So I have used my privilege and my networks to connect them to communities that are in Nova Scotia isolated, rural. Those communities would never have access to the climate scientists I'm working to, perhaps typically, or to the geologists that co-founded Rural Watch to me. So we have to find ways to connect to communities, those with power or academics who are working in these areas, or allies, to find ways or avenues through which to reach communities that would otherwise not have access to those networks, and particularly communities that are rural. So I've tried to find ways to do that and engage and bring the communities into, not necessarily into my space physically, but connect them to the people that can support them in doing their work. And when I look at Shelburne, for example, they've been able to address some of their issues because of the networks that they now have. And they've leveraged those networks now.
Well, thank you, Ingrid. I think that this is all the time that we have for today.
It needs to be an hour and a half.
Yeah, we really would like to thank you for joining us for this very insightful discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, your authenticity, these reflections, and your inspiration, that pointing out the successes that have occurred in a very difficult world. So we really appreciate this. I also appreciate that these types of time constraints in terms of a conversation like this are not, it's not an Indigenous way, and it's not the way that we would like to do things. So we'd like to continue an ongoing conversation. And that brings us up to what PEGASUS and the new PEGASUS Institute is all about. We're going to have blogs, newsletters, perhaps a book coming out of things. We have one of our members who thought about a book on displacement, and we welcome your ideas in terms of using PEGASUS as a forum for education and interchange of ideas on peace, global health, and sustainability. Our next talk, as is in the chat, is tentatively scheduled with Paul Spiegel, a physician, professor, director at the Johns Hopkins Center for Humanitarian Health, formerly of the UN High Commission on Refugees, has worked with Médecins Sans Frontières, Médecins du Monde, the CDC on refugee issues. So that promises to be an inspiring presentation. And we hope to actually do this about twice a month at different times in the new year. So we welcome any of your suggestions, inputs, and even thinking about joining our organizing committee. Yes, we'd like to thank all of you also for joining us for this inaugural PEGASUS Institute event. If you wish to continue the conversation, I think that Ingrid is very interested in developing her network across the country and across the world. We had a few participants from the US and some other people registered from outside. Yes, so thank you again, Ingrid. Thank you also to Dorothy, Teresa, and thank all of you for joining us for this inaugural PEGASUS Institute event. Please stay healthy, stay safe as much as you're able to, and let's take care of each other during these very challenging COVID times.
Great.
Bye for now.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thanks for having me, Neil. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.